Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
This week we are covering two topics close to home. First, Michael will discuss a horrifying situation that unfolded at his home over the weekend when a masked individual lit fire to something in his garbage can, leading to an explosion and fire. Then we will be welcoming Darwin Forsyth back to the show, this time in his capacity as communication advisor for Mayor Jacob Frey's campaign. With Darwin, we will get into the shenanigans from this past weekend's DFL endorsing convention in Minneapolis, the breakdown in the voting system, and what steps the Frey campaign is taking to remedy the situation. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the show. So, Michael, I am going to let you kind of kick things off here and update our listeners about what happened. And first of all, how are you doing?
I'm exhausted, frustrated. Probably this is the most angry I've ever been in doing a podcast episode, and I'm trying to test on my poker face. But I am furious, very angry. I haven't slept. My family is safe. They're shaken. But I am on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm probably a good 15 or 20. This is going to be a first in trying to pull off a podcast episode when I'm this angry. So on Friday night, early in the morning, 12:49 a.m., I was woken to an explosion outside my house and an ensuing fire. And what I came to learn, so was my entire family, was that someone lit some incendiary device, firework, mortar style. I've seen a whole bunch of things described by police, but they lit something in the garbage can outside my house. It exploded and then caught on fire, and there was a massive fire at the end of my driveway. I live in Eagan. Just for context sake, it was trash day in my neighborhood. And so what the security footage showed was someone riding a bicycle parked out across the street from my house. They appeared to be looking at their phone and kind of checking if it seemed like they were confused if they were in the right spot or not. They then made a phone call. It sounded like they were coordinating with someone, and then walked across the street, flicked off my security camera, and then lit something on fire. I would describe the individual as, and it's the video you can on my Substack and on social media. I've released the video and you get a description of the individual. Riding a bike, I would just put them at 6 feet, little over, work out the math from there, slender build. They're wearing a gray sweatshirt, black pants, white tennis shoes. The Eagan Police, I've spoken with the Eagan Police Fire Department, also spoken with the FBI. They're investigating this as Eagan Police, Eagan Fire Department are investigating this as an arson. Let me just be clear with you about something. I am fucking furious. And if the person who did this thinks that you're going to come into my house, light an explosion, start a fire, and think that I'm just going to ignore that, you're out of your fucking mind. I've barely slept. I have been working with law enforcement and gathering as much information I can to share about this. I don't know who did this. I'm intentionally staying away from any motive that I know at this point. I have some ideas, and I'm intentionally staying away from a motive because it doesn't matter to me what the motive is right now. The objective is finding out who did this and making sure they're prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I'm going to tell you something that people need to realize. Waking up to an explosion and a fire outside your house changes you. This is something to which I have never experienced. My children didn't deserve this. My wife didn't deserve this. Nobody deserves this. And so this was garbage can destroyed, driveway damaged, my lawn was burned. This was a substantive act of arson outside my house. This is someone who decides to flick off a camera, park outside my house, and put some type of firework, incendiary device, whatever you want to call it, that causes an explosion and fire, is someone who I don't give a frog's fat ass what the motive was. It's dangerous, and I'm not going to rest and I'm not going to sleep until the person is caught, because that created such a fear of a fire and that type of thing. My children stood outside, looked out the windows at first and then stood outside and saw a fire at the end of my driveway. And so I'm going to defer to law enforcement, Eagan Police, Eagan Fire Department. Again, I've spoken with federal authorities too. It's being investigated as an arson. Is it serious? I would encourage listeners to, I'll put a link to my Substack where I laid out some of the information. If they have any information or know anything from the videos, to contact the Eagan Police Department. I'll put links in it. I also want to discuss a couple process things. Since this happened, I've basically done nothing else. And so I'm going to be, I didn't do an adequate promotion of our last week episode with former Representative Kelly Fenton and Julius Hernandez. We're going to do a double episode streaming on Friday to get caught up on that. I have done nothing other than work with law enforcement, ensure that my family is safe, collect information. Last night, I had the things that I had given enough to law enforcement to the point that I thought I could like write something a bit. This is without a doubt the most angry that I've been in certainly the history of doing this podcast, where I would love to say so much more than what I can right now. But I'm just going to make sure that whoever knows that if you're listening to this, I'm going to make sure you get caught. I'm going to make sure you get caught, and you're going to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, because you're not going to fucking come to my house in the middle of the night, light a firework off, nearly start my house on fire, and fucking think that I'm going to forget that, because I'm not. And I haven't forgot about it. My family is safe. They didn't deserve this. And I'm going to try my best to get through this episode, but I got to tell you something. I'm angry, and I never want anyone to have to experience it. And let me just say this: 4th of July things happen. People blow fireworks off. That's not what was done here. I encourage people to go look at the fire at the end of my driveway and the damage that was done, and how that could have escalated very easily. And the introduction of fire to my house and an explosion is not something that I'm ever going to forget. And the level of emotional intensity that I've had over the last few days, since this happened, is off the charts. And I'm trying to contain it. I need to, do other things. My family's safe. Law enforcement has what they need. But I have to tell you something. I am fucking furious, and it's not going to go away until the person's caught.
Thank you for sharing about that. Of course, I'm going to join you in not speculating anything, but I can only imagine how scary, how violating it feels. So thank you for doing all the work you have been doing to hopefully find this person. We're going to send you all our prayers and well wishes that is what happens. We are glad you are all safe, and we, keep us posted if there's anything to update or anything anyone can do to help. But we are thinking of you. I again, so scary, so unfortunate, so violating, and we're glad that it didn't go any further.
Thank you, Becky. Let's do this show.
We are excited to welcome Darwin Forsyth back to the episode. He is here in a new capacity. You are working on Mayor Frey's re-election campaign as communications advisor, and we have a lot to discuss based on this last weekend's endorsing convention. The Minneapolis DFL got together, had an endorsing convention. We've talked a lot about that on the Republican side in particular. I have a love-hate relationship with endorsing conventions, and I'm really excited to get into this and hear all about what is going on, what happened over the weekend, what the next steps are, because seems like there's a whole lot of shenanigans that went on. So Mayor Frey is running for his third term. There are a number of other candidates in the race, namely State Senator Omar Fateh, who is running under the socialist banner, seems to be heading into the weekend, was the main kind of opponent in this endorsing convention, and set the table about kind of how things were going into the convention, what the Frey campaign anticipated, what the strategy was, and what you anticipated ahead of time. And then we'll obviously get into what happened at the actual event.
Yeah, Becky, Michael, thank you both for having me back on again. At this point, it's given that not just conventions, but particularly Minneapolis conventions are a huge mess, which is an unfortunate statement about where we are in terms of the caucus convention process in Minnesota. I think that's a constant we're seeing more and more of in both parties these days. That being said, this wasn't just the this convention wasn't just the biggest mess of any convention I've ever been to. I've been to quite a few. There was a state DFL chair who I believe gave an interview saying he's been going to conventions for 43 years since he was 17, and that this is the worst one he's ever been to. Um, by far the most egregious failure of the convention was the fact that when the first ballots for the mayoral endorsement were announced, there were substantially lower number of votes by hundreds of votes, double digit percentages fewer than there were delegates and upgrade alternates at the convention. So we can go into the weeds on that later, but beyond, that's sort of the core of the challenge that the Frey campaign has filed with the Minnesota DFL. But I think the other big thing to take away before we get into the weeds of that is that there was plenty of coverage leading up to this convention about how the other things going wrong with it that aren't subject to a rules challenge. People shouldn't have to pay $70 for a pastrami sandwich. People shouldn't find out like which dates the convention is and isn't and where it's going to be held less than 2 weeks before the convention is supposed to be held. Campaigns shouldn't have to spend $1,100 to set up a folding table at the convention. Campaigns shouldn't have to pay $5,000 at any level, by the way, not just for
Wow.
mayor. Like for governor, yes, each mayoral campaign had to spend $5,000. The water at Target Center, malfunctioned at least one point for a period of several hours. Water either wasn't coming or was sporadic and haphazard. You're not allowed to bring food into Target Center, and the concessions that were open ran out of food at one point. So even the parts of the convention that aren't subject to a rules challenge, this is not how we should do things when choosing the mayor of the largest city in the country.
I do want to spend a little bit of time on that because as I was watching what happened and obviously the lead up, my husband came home on Friday and he is not a political person at all. I mean, he pays attention to what's going on, but he was listening to K-Fan on Friday and they were talking about the $40 pastrami sandwich. He came home and he's like, "Do you hear this drama at the DFL convention?" I mean, and so it's a big thing when it's getting that widespread. But Target Center just seems wild to me as a venue, and I've done a lot of these. I've gone to the BPUU conventions, gone to CD conventions, done the state convention, and that size and the cost that obviously is going to come with a venue of that amount. Having these candidates spend $5,000 to, I mean, essentially, which is mandated, right? You can't have Mayor Frey and Senator Fateh are not going to not spend that money. And obviously they knew that. So they got $10,000 from their candidates, basically to help fund this. You've been around the block. You've been doing this for a while. Michael, you were, vice chair or deputy chair of the MNGOP. Wild, right?
Yes, I mean the thing that I really want to defer to Darwin on some of the process complaints, but as he was talking, I've first of all attended a number of conventions over the years in a variety of capacities, but the fact that this convention, I'm looking at some of the process things, particularly that non like DFL internal party stuff related to some of the complaints. I mean, the fees that were expected from the campaigns, the not having proper refreshments, water. This seems conventions are, when I was certainly deputy chair of the party and I oversaw, along with the chair of the party at the time, the 2010 endorsing convention. I always viewed it like showing up to a casino. Like my job was to kind of walk around and make sure the activists got everything they needed. We had plenty of food, plenty of water, we had air conditioning, everything was working great. There's that element of a customer service that you're providing, and it was our job to kind of set the table for there to be a knockout, drag out fight. But operationally, the party gets judged on do the bathrooms work? Is there enough refreshments? Is there water? Is there Wi-Fi? Are there things like that? And where the party is responsible is also in the technology and the process that runs the venue. And it was very important when I was deputy chair that people, and that was a very contentious endorsing convention, it was very important that we, in the lead up to that convention, we did a number of, I was the chair of the rules committee. back in 2010, we live streamed the rules meeting to make sure that there was openness and transparency, because what is critically important is that when there is a convention, that people leave unified, and people can lose fairly, and it's incumbent upon the people running, and I think party officers and the leadership of the party, to make sure any convention where there is an endorsement, where there is an endorsement that is decided, that the losing side knows that they lost fairly, and that it's handled in a manner in which it's above criticism and approach. And that is, I'm going to defer to Darwin on some process things, but just operationally, it seemed that this was a very, very poorly run convention. One of the worst that I've ever heard about. I was not there, but one of the worst that I've ever heard about.
Becky, I'm happy to jump in. So I would concur with that, and I've seen many awful conventions at this point in my political career. But
Can I just say something before you go in?
yeah,
Let me just say something very quick. I have consistently been complimentary when I go out, since I've been the deputy chair of the party, and I've come out and being more bipartisan and talking on both sides from that kind of hat I was wearing. I have always been very complimentary of how the Democrats run conventions. You can look back at some of the archives of this podcast. State conventions, and it doesn't surprise me, Darwin, when you were at the DFL party, those were incredibly well-run conventions. They're fluid, they're dynamic, and it was an organized chaos. And so this one surprised me because, and I've learned a little bit more about kind of the history with the DFL in Minneapolis in particular, but Democrats usually do a great job, particularly at the state level, of doing this. And so this one is exceptionally bad based on where it came from. Didn't mean to interrupt you, Darwin. Go ahead.
no, undoubtedly, I think that's correct, and I think that the gulf between the Minnesota State Party and the Minneapolis DFL was on full display this weekend. I will say that, like, one thing that I enjoy about no longer being a DFL employee is that I don't have to pretend I think more highly of the caucus convention process generally than I did when I was a DFL party employee on payroll. Because I think that even independent of the city of Minneapolis, taking a step out to the sort of wider angle, like broader Minnesota audience that this podcast has, that our Minnesota elections, I think I don't want to speak for anyone else on this podcast, but Minnesota has very well run elections, I believe, as a matter of objective fact. I think it's easy to vote. I think that elections are secure. I think that we have a great Secretary of State in Steve Simon, who has done a very good job, even though he's a Democrat, of protecting the reputation of our elections. I think that I think that the caucus convention process is far less representative of what the median voter, not just in Minneapolis with respect to the Minneapolis convention, but also with state convention, in both parties, in multiple different jurisdictions. A certain type of person is going to spend a Minnesota summer weekend for most of the day, well into the evening, slugging it out over Robert's Rules of Order. And everyone else is going to bike with their kids or do literally anything else with their lives, literally
Correct.
anything at all, or nothing, would be a big improvement. And I think it's something that we're all going to have to wrestle with, as to what this means, that we have processes that aren't super open exclusionary. Some of these were individual failures of this convention and the Minneapolis DFL party unit, but it is also a systemic problem with the process generally that will be bigger than this year in this election.
Here.
Okay, so the three of us here are going to lead the charge and start up a caucus on removing the endorsement process across the table. Heard. I mean, it was just unfortunate that this also convention fell on one of the best weekends we've had in 2 months. So, but to that point, I think that this is where we can also kind of highlight some of the major failures when it comes to the balloting issue. So you were there, so correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm reading this, based on, or this is all based on tweets and news coverage. The first round of balloting, so electronic balloting was what was used to start. Now, is this something new for either the Minneapolis DFL or the DFL as a whole, of using electronic balloting?
The Minnesota DFL had used electronic balloting, I believe, at the state convention. That was not my favorite convention either, candidly, but I don't remember a total system-wide collapse of the software. And I'm not going to speak for our new DNC chair too much, but I guarantee you if Ken Martin had a convention where the first ballot results were so wildly inaccurate, he also wouldn't have tolerated moving forward to a second ballot without fixing the problem first.
Yes, and
Yep.
I certainly want to spend some more time chatting about that because I think that is pretty incredible. And you know, I was not at the party, but at the time, but I know the MNGOP has had some issues with electronic balloting. But again, not to the point where it was a complete and utter breakdown like this. I was there in 2020 when we had to take everything virtual. We spent a lot of time doing a lot of testing and with the system that we had and having individuals on the ground and, you know, virtually ready to help in case there was any sort of breakdown to ensure that there was able to be confidence in that. Now, there's always going to be some naysayers and nitpickers who are not going to be confident, but I think what is so compelling here is, so it was at 7:45 p.m. I mean, what, 7-10 hours after this convention began, that first round of voting, the ballots were completed. And that, similar to, again, on the Republican side, you have different rules and regulations in place. So candidates drop off if they don't meet a certain threshold. It took almost 2 hours to get the results from this first ballot.
Yes, so the first ballot was taken at 5, maybe 4:45, sometime like that. I can't remember precisely. That's when the first ballot was taken. Before that, there was a practice ballot for people to try to like learn the system where there were already warning signs, like no one got confirmation emails pretty much, like oh, certainly not in any timely manner. Like there's some woman stood up on the convention floor and said, "Did anyone raise your hand if you did not get a confirmation email?" I think almost every single hand at the convention hall went up. And then she said she wanted paper ballots, which the Fateh campaign did not want. And then the problem became, you know, it went from that sort of grain to a much bigger deal when the first ballot results came in multiple hours after the ballot was taken, because there were only 578 total votes. For context, there are about 800 total delegates to the Minneapolis DFL convention, and at the time of voting, there were over 1,000 delegates and alternates checked in, at least 750, likely closer to 800 of whom were delegates, upgraded alternates, or super delegates, distinguished party leaders, we call them. The Minneapolis mayor's race was why the vast majority of delegates were there. By far the most hotly contested, high interest business of the convention. Does anyone really believe that 100, 200, whatever it was, delegates, over 20% of them, would skip voting on that contest? I have not seen a single credible explanation for how that number could be so low. Either the system received the ballots and didn't tabulate them correctly, or people were not able to cast their votes at all. Either scenario is disqualifying. In my opinion. I think that's especially true because one candidate was eliminated by not 1%, but by one vote. They just barely fell below the drop rule. Which, by the way, you know, the drop rule for this convention was set at an extraordinarily high level. I don't know if you guys have ever been at a Republican convention with a 20% drop rule on the first ballot.
Isn't that number is very high, and isn't that done? Please correct me both if you think I'm wrong, but isn't that done to force an endorsement?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speak for the Minneapolis DFL, but it's no secret that and this isn't part of the complaint because this isn't grounds for contestant, but like it's no members of the Minneapolis DFL, members of the Minneapolis DFL Rules Committee, like it's very clear what the goal was here. Like the goal was to deliver an endorsement to Senator Fateh for a lot of people involved. And, you know, that's fair. It's all in the game. But I think that people were so determined to march toward an outcome that we glossed over, hey, like, I have no doubt that Senator Fateh would have been, not necessarily no doubt, but it's very possible that Senator Fateh would have had a lead if the first ballot had been taken correctly. I'm skeptical the results would have been identical to what they were. I think it's very possible some candidates might not have been eliminated, but regardless of what the outcome is, it should be accurate, and we can't
For
move
sure.
forward like without, Democrats shouldn't be the caricature that Republicans try to make us out to be in these processes.
A couple thoughts I have on that. 20% is insane in my opinion. I mean, I think in my experience of either being a chair of a BPOU or being on a campaign or with a state party, usually it's about 5% on the first ballot and then goes up. I mean, 20% maybe by the third ballot. Um, that's really high and definitely shows that there was a mission there. I also think the numbers, I mean, obviously the math just ain't mathing, right? I mean, if 150 or 200 folks truly did not vote, that would be a statement, right? That would be a group, a coalition that got together to prove a point that they were not voting for a reason. That would be something that they would have, some coalition that would have flyers or, get up at the mic and make an announcement. I mean, that's not something that they would just didn't do.
And to that,
Again, on one of the, oh, go ahead.
oh yes, apologies for interrupting you, Becky. And yes, to that point, I agree. They would have voted like no endorsement in mass. Probably they wouldn't have skipped the ballot entirely. They would have voted no endorsement in mass, or like I don't know, maybe they would have done a press conference at the hall. The
Yep.
other, like one of the more minor, not really minor. It's a straight up compliance issue, but like another problem that the ballot had is when it was sent out, no endorsement wasn't an option on the ballot. They added no endorsement is required in DFL to always be an option on any ballot. And it wasn't listed there at all. And 3/4 of the way through, after people had submitted their ballots, someone pointed this out, and then they redid the form and said people can just like go like redo or retake it if they want to, which that's not how this works.
My question was to you, just to kind of help me understand this. Was the software, first of all, the internet's on the computer now. So the fact that it took that long for the ballot to come back is puzzling. What was the software? Is it a proprietary internal DFL software, or who was the architect, and who was this an outside vendor? What was the software package that was being used, and what was the origin of it?
So I don't pretend to understand all of it because even though I'm about 75 years younger than Michael, I am
Ouch.
not the most tech savvy person in the world. But
Ouch.
it was a jot form link, which is not how we should do these, in my opinion. But uh, the fact here's what I'll say about like the software and technicality glitch. There have been some concerns raised that I won't get too far ahead of our complaint here about some individuals, like or one individual in particular's involvement in the process, but the fact that like I think in our complaint we outlined either this happened or this happened, and either one is disqualifying for the results. The fact that we don't know which of those two things happened is also disqualifying. Like the fact that there's still so much like murkiness and non-transparency over how we got these numbers is an issue. And it wasn't just campaigns that had the reaction when there were only 578 votes. Normal people who don't work for campaigns or labor unions or who aren't sort of like professional politicos, were like looking around each other like that there weren't just 578 people who wanted to vote here. To put a coda on it, at 9:20 p.m., this is after a lot of people had already left because they were hungry or needed to drink water or were just fed up and disillusioned with how the first ballot had gone. At 9:20 p.m., there were 699 delegates and upgraded alternates. Are we supposed to believe that several hours earlier during the first ballot for mayor that only 578 people voted?
Yeah, I was told there would be no math, but that doesn't add up.
It's again, like if we had lost this endorsement fair and square under a legitimate process, we would have had a very simple path forward. It would have been Mayor Frey has never done as well with delegates as he does with the voters. He's never finished first at a DFL convention once as mayor, and we would just be plowing forward, muscling through it, like making the case for pragmatic progressive vision for the city. We would not have filed this complaint if we didn't think there were serious grounds for overturning the outcome.
I think one thing that's, I think there's so many things that are concerning about this. Obviously, the vote numbers. I think I was glad you brought up that it is mandated the no endorsement, because on the Republican side, I'm pretty sure a specific motion has to be made and has a certain threshold of delegate votes required to push for no endorsement. That's not typically on the first ballot. I think it can be added at a time after, subsequently by motion, though. Sorry, delegates, correct me if I'm wrong if things have changed on the MNGOP side. So that to me is just, and you were a delegate yourself, right?
I sure was.
Because I saw that you made a motion from the floor. So you and the campaign were actively trying to change and fix things as this was ongoing. It wasn't like you just let it all happen and came in, in the 11th hour and tried to attack it after the fact. You, from my reading, made a motion on the floor to not only move to paper ballots, but redo that first ballot with those candidates who had been dropped. And one thing that I always love about endorsing conventions, the one thing that I love about them, is I do believe they're like a chess match, that they, because the rules are the way they are, if you know the rules better than the other side, you typically can get things done. And one thing I have found, love it or hate it, Republicans are a stickler for the rules a lot of times. And so many times I've seen somebody make a motion and folks, even if they're not on that side, join on with that motion because Robert's rules say this, we're going to do things by the book. Were you surprised that that motion to, one, not even move to paper ballots, but that the body was not receptive to trying to remedy the situation as it was being a dumpster fire?
I wasn't surprised that the motion for no endorsement to suspend the rules and redo it with paper ballots didn't move forward because the Fateh campaign, those motions require like a 2/3 vote, and the Fateh campaign was not going to,
Gotcha.
was not going to have their delegates like sign on to that.
I have a process question also about, attending a convention. What is the registration process like? Do they, because you described that some people heard about the convention at, not as fast as others. And is there an initial credentials report that kind of lays out, here's who's here? And there is, because, obviously Republicans, being a, former party officer, I understand that perspective from the kind of the credentialing process. That's always a big process because I was staff at the last state convention on the Republican side that didn't endorse, and the party changed the rules, and we made some credentialing rule changes in the aftermath of the campaign that I worked on that was successful in blocking an endorsement, ensuring that there wasn't one. But what's the credential process to, make sure that the delegates that are there are properly seated? Because it seems that one of the things that, again, as much as I don't want to get into math, the numbers are really, there's a big flux between the numbers. I mean, you just laid out between that first ballot and, the later ballots. Is the floor open? Because I remember being at conventions where Democrats were like, okay, the floor is frozen now. You can't leave or go. Are those the type of rules that are applied there, during voting and during that credentialing process?
Yeah, so there's a lot about that I don't understand. I'm just the simple comms guy here, but I will
Simple
say
caveman lawyer. I get it.
there were new, I will say, like, there were numerous like well documented and independent reports of delegates and alternates who were inexplicably removed as delegates or downgraded before at the DFL convention, or who had trouble getting upgraded when they should have been. Um, and that's also very concerning in a situation like this, where, again, like with that 20% drop rule, one candidate finishing at, I believe, 19.93%, one vote short of making the threshold, like quite literally every vote matters there. And yeah, I mean there were numerous issues. By far the biggest one was the inaccurate first ballot, but that alone was not the only thing that not just like led to this challenge to the results, but I think it left a lot of Democrats involved like very disinclined to volunteer with the party, to be involved
Yep.
at many levels. And
Yep.
I think the big winner from the convention was actually not Senator Fateh. I think it was the Minnesota Republican Party. I think that the
Hmm.
Minnesota Republicans benefited more than anything from a process that lacked legitimacy and that left many Democrats, very reluctant to be involved, not just with the Minneapolis DFL, but with the Minnesota DFL writ large, because they felt, their voices and votes quite literally weren't counted. And it was not a pleasant experience for anyone involved there. So that's why when we filed the complaint, we asked for expedited review from the state party, because no one benefits from there being question marks hanging over this for months on end.
Good points.
I want to move on to that. And obviously, before we do, it should go without saying that it did end, the convention did end with Senator Fateh being endorsed by the waving of badges, which is a whole nother thing. First of all, I also have to say this episode is such inside baseball and we are such nerds that I absolutely love it. So thank
I
you
love
for
this
nerding out
episode.
with us.
Sorry for the content, Darwin. I'm sorry it's coming at, but this is the nerd content we just love.
Love. But I do want to chat about this appeal. So yesterday, yesterday Mayor Frey's campaign filed an appeal with an endorsement challenge to the state party, one of several being filed, and it centers on, like you mentioned, the extraordinarily high number of missing or uncounted votes produced by the highly flawed and untested electronic voting system used in the balloting for the mayor's race at the Minneapolis DFL City Convention. Your words, not mine. That's from the press release that came out yesterday. Talk to us a little bit about why this is important and what comes now.
Yeah, I think that in my memory, this is not a small, like, this is not action any of us took lightly. It's a big thing to, like, put this on the state party's plate. And we wouldn't have done it if we didn't both very strongly feel that, like, there was a accuracy issue. Even one of our opposing candidates who isn't joining the challenge has issued a statement saying the numbers don't add up for the first ballot there. But yeah, the DFL endorsement, especially in the city of Minneapolis, confers a lot of advantages, and so it's our campaign's obligation to, contest them if we don't feel like it was, accurately conferred. I also genuinely, with my DFL hat, think it's a terrible precedent to set for not just Minneapolis politics, but for DFL politics generally. If missing 20% of the results, if, a inaccurate first ballot is not grounds to overturn an endorsement, then what is? What incentive is there for any DFL party unit to follow appropriate, like, practice and procedure and to make sure that results are accurate? There really isn't any at that point. Like, if this goes, anything goes. So yes, we have a
Yep.
self-interested outcome here, no dispute or argument there. It is also genuinely bigger than this campaign, the Minneapolis mayor's race, and then even bigger than the city of Minneapolis, in my opinion.
I'm going to piggyback and jump in here for a second on Darwin's point. He is, as he was saying this, I'm thinking to myself, he is absolutely right. And I want to once again talk about myself for just a second. And why I think that is because one of the things that I have appreciated, and I will discuss this, I don't like the questions about elections, the election, the accuracy of elections. I am someone, and Becky, we spoke to probably the biggest election nerd in the state, which is Secretary Steve Simon. We had him on. That episode was an absolute nerd fest. I think he does a remarkably good job of making sure that our elections are fair in an incredibly contentious time. Furthermore, I'll also say that one of the things that I have always operationally respected about the DFL is their ability, and we can talk about this a bit more when Darwin's not on, so he doesn't have to hear this. But let me just say something to you. The fact that this is not, I have not seen this before. I have not seen this level of dysfunction. And he is absolutely right. And as someone who staked a flag the last election cycle on the importance of democracy and voting in our institutions, I want to say that Darwin's points really resonate with me. It is an absolutely larger issue than just an endorsing convention. It really puts a pox on the House of the DFL, who has traditionally done a good job running conventions. And he is correct. This is the largest city in the state. This is the endorsement for the largest city in the state. And this adds a level of dysfunction and chaos to a party that has not had that. And I do think sadly, he is correct that it does benefit the Minnesota Republicans. But bottom line, this really goes to an issue for me that I've respected the Democrats so much about. That's why I endorsed Secretary Steve Simon. That's why I was a Republican for Harrison Walz, was because they didn't engage in this type of stuff. And the fact that this happened this past week in the DFL, I just wanted to just echo what he was saying and say with being as bipartisan I can, but also just being not wearing a partisan hat. He is absolutely right in saying that this has much larger ramifications, because the way the Democrats have run things has been something that I have seen as someone who's called balls and strikes, but someone who has supported some candidates in the past. I have greatly respected and appreciated, and that changes what occurred last weekend. Changes that.
Completely agree. I mean, I think going up against a two-term mayor is going to be tough for anybody. Understandably, the endorsement is a big deal for Senator Fateh and obviously for Mayor Frey as well. But as a candidate, I've seen more from candidates as well, that they want to be able to stand on their endorsement, that they want to make sure that the rules are followed and that they won fair and square. So there is no question in how they got where they got, because unlike a lot of races, and for anybody who might not be aware, there is no primary, right? This goes to ranked choice voting. So if results are left as is if there is no other if it's not overturned, gone to no endorsement, or redone to make sure that it is done fair and square, and regardless of the outcomes of that, at this point, Senator Fateh would be the endorsed candidate, receiving data, resources, spending from the state party, from the local party, from other candidates that might, do joint mailers or anything of that sort. And so, I think it is, unlike other races like governor, where Governor Walz or Governor Dayton did not receive the endorsement, went on to win the primary. This is the last kind of guardrail between now and the November election, and so it's a big deal. Any closing words, Darwin, on when we expect to know more? Obviously, there's a lot that I'm sure the state party has to dive into. Do you know the next steps of what we can see and when we can see it?
Not all of them. My understanding, and I'm, again, not a rules guy, not lead on the campaign, on the, internal workings of the appeal, but my understanding is that it's like a early-ish August timeline here for some resolution from the DFL version of I believe it's the Rules and Bylaws Committee at the DNC level. I don't remember the exact acronym for the DFL. So the other thing I'll add here, though, is that we're optimistic about, our challenge, given the facts and, severity of the issue, but that the mayor in pretty much any major American city would be, at the left edge of that city's politics. Mayor Frey is, has very few friends on the right and is, justifiably described in national circles as a very progressive mayor. And that he is going to continue, like, he is a DFLer, he will be on the ballot as a DFLer, and we are going to make the case that we have two very different choices ahead for the city's future. The mayor, has a record. He has a very pragmatic, progressive record that we're proud of. We have a vision for the city where we want to prove that Democrats can run cities in a way that actually works and delivers for our residents rather than, become sort of symbols of unaffordability and dysfunction that we've seen in other major cities. And, independent of the outcome of the endorsement and our appeal, we still feel very confident that the voters are going to be receptive of that message in November.
Darwin, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate you coming on in this new capacity, and we would welcome the opportunity to have you back at any later point, okay?
Always a pleasure.
Bye.
Becky, we just interviewed Darwin Forsyth, who's now with Mayor's Frey campaign, with a nerdfest breakdown on the endorsing convention in Minneapolis. I know you really enjoyed that discussion. Your take and perspective.
It's hard for me to, I have no horse in this race, right? It matters zero to me. I don't live in the city. I don't care. Obviously for the Republican side, as Darwin said, certainly a socialist moving on and being selected and uplifted by the DFL has benefits to the Republican Party. But having no horse in the race, looking at this subjectively, it's hard not to look at all of the shenanigans that went on and not think there was something nefarious going on.
No
not
question
think
about
that
it.
there was some puppet masters, making sure that this went the way it went, regardless of how they got there. It just, again, like I mentioned, one of the things that I do love about the endorsement process is knowing the rules to the game better than your opponents allow you to navigate and manipulate them in a way, not manipulate them meaning break them, but bend them to your will. and
Yes.
And
It's a great
that's where
statement.
I've seen so many times where, whether it's a candidate who wants to make sure that it's a great and easy and straightforward process, or a delegate. The fact that when Darwin stood up and said, "Hey, listen, this first ballot, the numbers don't math, the amount of time, the threshold, these folks dropping off, we just need to start over and do it by paper." Yes, Frey being from Team Frey or not, the fact that there wasn't more support for that just seems absolutely crazy to me. And that they allowed this to go on in a way where the numbers weren't there, the rules weren't being followed. There was questionable whether the floor was secure and it was delegates, and that we end up voting via card. Republicans would never, would never at the MNGOP let that happen.
Correct. And a couple of things. First of all, let me just say I completely agree with you. Let me also just say something about Darwin now that where he's off and we can talk about him. First of all, I was very surprised when he left the DFL.
Me
I
too.
consider Darwin to be an absolute amazing tactician, incredibly smart, incredibly talented. There has been numerous tweets and press releases that he sent out that I've been like, damn, that's good. Even when I don't agree with the message or the process or the perspective, he is very sharp and knows what he's doing. So the fact that he left, I was very surprised that he left the DFL. And I'm also very surprised because if you take a step back for a second and think about this, we have not had a lot of these kind of process things bog down the DFL. There's endorsing conventions at the local level. They're always a little bit cantankerous, but not at the city level and not something of this significance. And the fact that Darwin, who is not someone I agree with politically on, I think, probably a lot of any issues, is out there raising these concerns. I have found him to be a very fair arbiter and good at calling balls and strikes. So when he raises a concern about this process, particularly where he came from, I think it's an informed perspective, and I really want to listen to it. I also think he's spot on about the Democrat brand in this state, the DFL brand in this state, excuse me, regarding elections, election integrity. It has largely been the Republicans who have engaged in these kind of questions and doubts and things like that. And the concerns that the Frey campaign has are very, very substantive. The math, as you say, just doesn't math. And so something stinks here, and there's a problem. And I think as he was talking about it, I realized that this is the problem. This is the problem with endorsing conventions. And I think we're all on board with getting rid of the caucus system and moving straight to a primary. I think this is the umpteenth reason why it needs to happen. But one of the biggest things, Becky, that can happen is I remember the 2008 convention in Rochester. And it was one of the worst run conventions that the state party ever had. It was conflict, it was fights, it was the McCain people versus the Ron Paul people. It was a very poorly run convention from the convention chair and everyone else. And I ran as deputy chair in the aftermath of that. And I ran for deputy chair in 2009. And one of the things I campaigned on was we have to have a good convention. We have to allow Republicans, we have to have run a very tight, well-run convention. And so we did things entirely different than had been previously done. And we created a level of transparency and openness in the process, which that led to, at the state convention in 2010 that was held at the Minneapolis Convention Center, Tom Emmer was endorsed, Marty Seifert lost, but everyone left that convention united, ready to go. And the Republicans almost won statewide office that year. It was very close. Emmer barely lost. But it wasn't because we wanted to make sure that people left that convention in a unifying way, even people who supported the other side. And what Darwin is saying is the fact that there's this dysfunction inside the DFL over these types of issues. This is going to be a problem for the DFL if they don't get a hold of this. And I think, again, I'm not a Minneapolis Republican, I'm not a Minneapolis Democrat, but just watching what I've seen on social media, I think this was a setup. I think that they wanted to endorse they want to endorse anyone possible they could other than the incumbent mayor. And it's pretty clear from a rules perspective, from a process perspective, that the math doesn't math and the rules were not broken, not bent, they were broken, and this thing stinks.
Absolutely agree. And I think this is something that seems to have been bubbling up a little bit within Minneapolis politics on the left. We've seen a little bit, when it comes to the city council versus Frey and some of the socialists, the Democrat socialists that have been endorsed and then elected to the city council, and some of the fighting that we've seen there trying to get a veto-proof majority on a variety of issues to buck Frey and his will. And, leading up to this, there was a new coalition that had been formed called Protect Our Platform. And it was DFL activists that were kind of their goal or their efforts were to block any candidate from being endorsed by both the Minnesota DFL and the Democrat Socialists of America. And then under a rule change that was proposed by this group, candidates winning both endorsements would have to accept the backing of only one. And I think this is, from my perspective and my viewing of this, they eventually did withdraw that because through, their conversations and everything, it was thought to be too divisive, and that wasn't their intention to do. But from my perspective, if this was happening on the Republican side, it's them saying, we don't want the socialists taking over our city and our party. And so you have to choose. If you want to be a socialist and run for mayor, you can be a socialist and run for mayor under the socialist bandwagon or banner, but not under the DFL. And so it's clear that there's been this has been going on. Obviously we weren't there, we're not in the room, we're not flies on the wall. And but now that Darwin's not here, we can speak to motives, and it just really does seem like there was some sketchiness from the party officials that were at the Minneapolis DFL, who did not uphold the rules, did not ensure that this was a safe, fair, free balloting election process, and seemed to potentially lean one way, and that does not appear to be the mayor.
Yep. And I will say, as a Republican who supported Democrats, one of the reasons why was their advocacy, their faith in our democratic institutions. And the Democrats have a real issue inside their house that they got to get figured out here right now, because I think I completely agree with Darwin and others that this could be a long-term problem if it's not resolved. So we'll be following it. And of course, I will, without discussing production on the air, we'll reach out to the other side, anyone else in that, and see if they want to come on too. Your thought.
I just, one final thought is, two final thoughts here. I want to say this is the first endorsement of a mayoral candidate in 16 years when RT Ryback broke through the 60%. I thought that was a fun fact. But also putting back on my Republican hat, I do think that this is something that, regardless of the outcome, I think that will, as we head towards 2026, we'll be talking a lot about. I think the rise of the socialists within the Democratic Party as a whole, and getting to higher positions of candidacy and being elected, I think is something that I expect to be a messaging point leading up to that 2026 convention. I know we saw that a little bit when surrounding this convention. I saw some national news about it. I saw some national folks on Twitter pick up that the new DFL chair mentioned Democrat socialists in his, when he's listing off who makes up the Democratic Party, the DFL party. So I do think this is something that I would anticipate being a messaging point that we see as we move forward about the factions within the DFL, which, bravo, I will just say it is nice to have a party that is dysfunctional like the Republicans.
That's a very positive note to end this podcast. Becky, that was very kind of you. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank also our listeners for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show us some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at @BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.